When James Franklin was arrested, he was taken to a stone jail just across the street from his print shop. He was never formally charged with committing any crimes. The council that ordered the arrest of James had Samuel Sewall on it. He was infamous for being one of the 9 judges in the Salem witch trials. Sewall would later repent for his role in Salem and ask for forgiveness for taking part in those trials, but he would not tolerate the government being made to look weak. The arrest may not have been an accident, but a message. On June 5th, a week before James's arrest, both Philip Musgrave and John Campbell, publishers of the Boston Gazette and Boston Newsletter, were also called into the governor's council to answer questions about items they've printed. Musgrave and Campbell were reprimanded for printing a list of councilors at government proceedings but forgetting to include 2 popular party members who had been chosen but vetoed by the governor. Both men apologized and were ordered not to print actions of the general court, except from official reports. Unable to justify the arrests of Campbell and Musgrave, they may have found what they were looking for when they arrested James, who didn't apologize initially. A person can only imagine the humiliation James must have felt being imprisoned within eyesight of his 16-year-old younger brother who was now running his business. Benjamin and James didn't have the happiest of relationships. As Ben stated when he started, I thought he demeaned me too much in some he required of me. Yet despite this friction, Ben wanted to contribute, yet he feared rejection from James, stating, being still a boy and suspecting that my brother would object to printing anything of mine in his paper if he knew it to be mine. And so Ben felt it necessary to disguise his own contributions to the paper. Now in control, he was likely torn. Even though Ben had personal disputes with his brother, the manner of his arrest likely made him afraid of what could be published. Yet the injustice of it and his ambition likely inclined him to draft a response. In the issue after James's arrest, the editorials consisted of a man defending his character in the opinion of some ladies he possibly offended by his conversation with them. Another is written in response to Dogood's essay on hoop petticoats, stating heart is the cause of pride, not the apparel. The following week we see Silence Dogood return with an essay mocking New England poetry via the form of their elegies. Silence then provides a recipe for creating them, that was of course left by her husband. I shall here subjoin a receipt for that purpose which was left me as a legacy among other valuable rarities by my reverend husband. It is as follows. For the title of your elegy, you must be sure not to omit the words Aetetis soi, which will beautify it exceedingly. For the subject of your elegy, take one of your neighbors who has lately departed this life. It is no great matter at what age the party died, but it will be best if he went away suddenly, being killed, drowned, or frozen to death. Having chose the person, take all his virtues, excellencies, etc., and if ye have not enough, you may borrow some to make up a sufficient quantity. To these add his last words, dying expressions, etc., if they are to be had. Mix all these together, and be sure you strain them well. Then season all with a handful or 2 of melancholy expressions, such as dreadful, deadly, cruel, cold death, unhappy fate, weeping eyes, etc. Have mixed all those ingredients well, put them into the empty skull of some young Harvard, and having prepared a sufficient quantity of double rhymes such as power, flower, quiver, shiver, grievas, levas, tell you, excel you, expeditions, physicians, fatigue him, intrigue him, etc., you must spread all upon paper, and if you can procure a scrap of Latin to put at the end, it will garnish it mightily. Then, having affixed your name at the bottom with the Mesis Composui, you will have an excellent elegy. Ben's take on New England poetry may be amusing, But here we get a first sense that he's testing the waters in a pretty dangerous situation. Using silence as the writer, he's testing to see what reaction might come of this from the Boston Council. Although Puritan women like Anne Bradstreet had had their poetry published by their husbands, it was generally frowned upon for them to pursue writing in any public or professional setting. Was Ben testing the council in this situation, or just having a bit of fun? People close to James did take up his cause to get him free from prison. On June 20th, a petition reached the courts to free James Franklin. In order to get the court to consider an early release, in the petition they state, James Franklin, printer, humbly showing that he is truly sensible, and heartily sorry for the offense he has given to this court and the late current, and truly acknowledges his inadvertency and folly therein affronting the government, as also his indiscretion and indecency when before the court. The petition also cited their concern about the prison ruining James's health. To back their claims about James's health, they needed a doctor to examine him and sign off on it. In an ironic twist of fate, it was Abdiel Boylston, the same doctor James's newspaper had maligned and whose reputation they had brought to near ruin, that would become his savior, signing off on his health issues. On July 7th, James Franklin was released from jail. The council determined he would owe over £100, or quadruple the yearly salary of the average worker at the time. The week of James's release saw another post by Silence Dogood on the 9th. This was not a post she wrote, but rather she provided an entire piece that was published by the London Journal that coincidentally aligned with James's predicament. It opened with this: "Without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom, and no such thing as public liberty. Without freedom of speech, which is the right of every man, as far as by it, he does not hurt or control the right of another. And this is the only check it ought to suffer, and the only bounds it ought to know." With James back in charge, and only 2 days until release, he wasn't going to publish something himself. Instead, he put this essay, one chosen by his brother, on his front page. In these 3 weeks, Benjamin had shown he could run a printing press and publish a newspaper. And despite their disagreements, the selection of this essay shows his solidarity with James over his arrest. Despite the risky situation, Ben didn't leave, nor offer to return to work for his father. In the same issue of the Courant, an advertisement from Josiah Franklin offered a 40-shilling reward to anyone who could safely bring back the 20-year-old Irish servant he had indentured to replace his son. It wasn't until the July 16th article of the Courant that James published an extensive response to his arrest. James goes for sympathy in this piece, dedicating a significant portion of this article to a crude poetic submission he received celebrating his arrest. He would compare it to nothing else but the pelting a criminal with rotten eggs while he is suffering the law. The verse starts with, "Father of discord, maker of division, broacher of strife, and follower of sedition, to tax our learned youth with want of knowledge, and imprudently satirize our college, to lout our pious judges with disgrace, and fault our rulers to their very face. Ah, scoundrel wretch, your vile current has spread its poison far and wide. No matter you were dead, and your currents all burn, that you have such discord bred." It continues on in this manner, till reaching its dramatic conclusion. "Why do you pine so, and your speech so falter, you impious wretch, when deserve a halter? Or in a stinking jail to lie and rot, not should people pity you a jot. Marry, good sir, a jail we think's too good for you and others of the factious brood. We hope to see you on a gibbet dangle, with all the meddling crew that love to wrangle." James would follow up this mocking celebration with the following question: "I would fain ask these my very good friends, whether they know of any order of men among us without their faults. If they do not, what can the meaning of this doggerel be, but that it is a greater crime in some men to discover a fault than for others to commit it. He finally concludes with, "I say, I dare not express myself thus freely in my own case, because I know not the power of a general assembly in his majesty's plantations, nor whether an Englishman may have liberty to answer for himself before the legislative power." In the following weeks, Silence and James would each take a week to write an article that was critical of the institutions involved in James's arrest. Silence speaks first, attacking the hypocrisy of false religious believers, stating, "The first artifice of a state hypocrite is by a few savory expressions which cost him nothing, to betray the best men in his country into an opinion of his goodness, and if the country wherein he lives is noted for the purity of religion, he the more easily gains his end. A public hypocrite every day deceives his betters, and makes them ignorant trumpeters of his supposed godliness. They take him for a saint, and pass him for one, without considering that they are, as it were, the instruments of public mischief out of conscience, and ruin their country for God's sake." Considering what James was arrested for, this seems risky, but there are also subtle degrees of caution. Silence isn't directly discrediting religion, but simply showing how false believers can deceive people into echoing their beliefs, following them on a wave to positions of power, which becomes especially risky if a man compounded of law and gospel is able to cheat a whole country with his religion and then destroy them under the color of law. At the same time, Silence also extends an olive branch. The reason of this blindness in the clergy is because they are honorably supported, as they ought to be, by their people, and see nor feel nothing of the oppression which is obvious and burdensome to everyone else. Contrasting this with James, who opens his paper with, "I have reflected with wonder on the stupidity of many of my countrymen, who know little or nothing of the happy constitution of an English government, and who are as unconcerned to know the liberties they enjoy thereby, as if it were a thing indifferent with them, whether they were protected by it or otherwise. For this reason I have sent you, in order to be published, the 29th chapter of the Magna Carta, which I doubt not will be of service to many of your readers, and will particularly oblige. The rest of the paper is largely dedicated to this chapter of the Magna Carta, which states, 'No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land.'" While James may make a great point with the Magna Carta, he starts by insulting the intelligence of his readers. He talks down to people and doesn't leave room for people to discover their own truths. While Benjamin leaves the possibility for an interpretation of inherent goodness in the common person, it's possible to say they're products of individuals who manipulate religions and judicial institutions. On October 8th, the final Silence Do-Good article was published. Silence once again targets religion, but her core message revolves around faith being around moral reforming character, not about zealotry, faction labels, or political manipulation through religion. However, when reading a phrase like, "It often happens that the most zealous advocates for any cause find themselves disappointed in the first appearance of success in the propagation of their opinion, and the disappointment appears unavoidable, and we are immediately filled with arguments to invalidate their former practice." As he continues publishing, he continues to find disappointment, whether it's the personal attacks against him in his paper, the lack of support or sympathy with his arrest, or the knowledge that his younger brother is very talented and likely to surpass him. As James is noble in cause for wanting a freer press, his attacks are doing him more harm than good, and subsequently their cause. Having difficulty finding material for Silence to write about, Ben stops submitting articles. Initially this goes unnoticed until writers begin to wonder where Silence is, prompting James to post an ad in the December 3rd Courant for any knowledge about where she might be. It's believed, shortly after this, that Benjamin confessed that he was writing a silence do-good. The contemptuous relationship of Benjamin and James wasn't helped by this confession. Benjamin describes the worsening relationship while reflecting in his autobiography over 50 years later. Our disputes were often brought before our father, and I fancy I was either generally in the right or else a better pleader, because the judgment was generally in my favor. But my brother was passionate and had often beaten me, which I took extremely amiss, and thinking my apprenticeship very tedious, I was continually wishing for some opportunity of shortening it, which at length offered in a manner unexpected. As James's resentment built, it wasn't long before taking it out on Ben was enough. He had to use the outlet of his paper once again, and he would do so on January 14th, 1723. On the front page would be an article attacking the hypocrisy of religion, beginning in a manner similarly to the final silence article. It begins with, "It is an observation no less true than sorrowful, which some have made, that there are many persons who seem to be more than ordinary religious, but yet are of several accounts worse by far than those who pretend to no religion at all. Indeed, all their fine pretenses to religion are only to qualify them to act their villainy the more securely." But unlike Benjamin's article, which attacks false believers using the institutions that do the evil, this article begins to pivot to attack the religious themselves as well as the religion. How unaccountable is it that men profess the Christian religion should do those things which many Turks and heathens would blush to mention? "Give me an honest man," say some, "for all a religious man," a distinction which I confess I never heard of before. The whole country suffers for the villainies of a few such wolves in sheep's clothing, and we are all represented as a pack of knaves and hypocrites for their sakes. Moreover, religion itself suffers extremely by the dishonest practices of those who profess it, so they presently conclude that religion itself is nothing but a cunningly devised fable, a trick of state invented to keep mankind in awe. This essay does not bear the signature of an author, yet James would still publish it. Where the first article about pirates led to James's arrest, it seems James was prepared this time. He went into hiding, and the next week's Courant would feature a printing of a Psalm of David. On January 21st, the council decided James was to be arrested, and on the 24th, a warrant was issued. James was also ordered to pay the bond that he already owed in 12 months' time, and he would be banned from publishing the New England Courant or any other paper or pamphlet unless it was supervised by the secretary of the province. Despite these setbacks, James had one last idea to keep his dream alive. While in hiding, he would sign the back of Benjamin Franklin's indenture, freeing him from his servitude, only to have him sign a new indenture that would keep him bound to James for the remainder of his contract. With Benjamin being free publicly, the Courant could still be published, but under his name. The issue of the New England Courant, February 11th, would contain this notice on the front page. The late publisher of this paper, finding so many inconveniences, would arise by his carrying the manuscripts and public news to be supervised by the secretary, as to render his carrying it on unprofitable, has entirely dropped the undertaking. The present publisher, having received the following piece, desires the readers to accept of it as a preface to what they may hereafter meet within this paper. Publicly, even though he was now the legal publisher of the New England Courant, Benjamin Franklin remained an indentured servant in private. James had found a workaround that would allow him to continue publishing his newspaper freely, but he had done so at the expense of his own brother's freedom. James would eventually post a sizable amount of bond, allowing him to re-emerge publicly, and the officials would let it slide since they believed he wasn't publishing his own paper. Contempt of court charges against James would be dropped when brought before the General Assembly, allowing him to not name the individuals responsible for the articles that led to his arrest. The constant tension between brothers and the fact that Benjamin knew how to run a paper would make Ben finally take it upon himself to seriously consider breaking free from James. But James seemed aware that his brother intended on leaving. He would visit every printer in Boston and tell them not to hire his brother. Even more concerning is what would happen if Benjamin were to break his indenture. He would risk serious punishment and damage to his reputation. Caught runaways would be placed back in their owner's service, usually had their indenture extended, and then could face fines, whipping, branding, or the pillory. However, Benjamin was willing to gamble that James wouldn't pursue him because if he did, it would significantly increase the risk that the council found out there was a secret indenture, and the scam James had concocted would be ruined. A year prior, Benjamin had proposed to my brother that if he would give me weekly half the money he paid for my board, I would board myself. He instantly agreed to it, and I presently found that I could save half of what he paid me. Part of that board money was for food, and Franklin, who had discovered vegetarianism, ate less meat and relied on biscuits and other cheaper forms of food to begin saving. In addition to these savings, he would sell many of his books. By September of 1723, he had found a ship sailing to New York. Wishing to make a discreet runaway, he would have one of his friends tell the captain that Franklin needed to get away from Boston because he had gotten a girl pregnant and her family was looking for him. He would quietly sneak aboard without anyone else from Boston knowing. On the final page of the New England Courant, on September 30th, 1723, an ad was placed. James Franklin, printer in Queen Street, wants a likely lad for an apprentice. 1723 must have been an emotional year for James. Despite his order for arrest at the beginning of that year, James would get married on his birthday, February 4th, to Anne Smith. For James, whose current introduced itself to the world as soaring now and then with the grave wits of the age, he had already been arrested twice by the time of Benjamin's departure. The loss of Ben was more than the loss of a brother, and was the loss of his paper's most promising prospect. James had pride, but pride had blinded James to the idea that even though he was fighting for a freer press, and by extension more liberty, he had been the oppressor in his relationship with his brother. Benjamin would return in less than a year to visit, this time with the patronage of the governor of Philadelphia. He would show up at James's shop to show off the silver coins he had made working for a printer in that city. His brother couldn't say anything, only leave the room. James confided in his mother that Benjamin insulted him in such a manner before his people that he could never forget or forgive it. Benjamin had become the legal justification for the existence of his newspaper, which would continue to be printed under Ben's name until James stopped publishing the Courant on June 25, 1726. Having been worn down by the Mathers and the government, he would move his family and his press to Rhode Island. In Newport, he would start the first newspaper in that state, the Rhode Island Gazette, releasing its first issue on September 27, 1732, but it would only publish sporadically and officially stopped printing the following year, largely in part due to James's failing health. The same year, his second paper failed. He would receive another visit from Benjamin that would be described as a reconciliation in his letters. James's take is lost to history, but according to Ben, James wanted him to look after his son, James Jr., after he passed. On February 4th, 1735, James Franklin would die at the age of 38. His wife Anne would take over his printing press, first publishing a brief essay on the number 7. She would secure a contract with the government of Rhode Island, becoming their official printer from 1736 until her death in 1763. She would later start her own newspaper, the Newport Mercury. As for James Jr., he'd be sent to school for a few years before returning to live with his uncle Benjamin. Ironically, he would be indentured for 7 years to the uncle who had broken his own indenture to his father. The breaking of said indenture that continued a series of events that would see to the slow professional demise of the boy's father. When James Jr. completed the contract, he would return and run the press in Rhode Island with his mother, building off of her continued success. Anne Franklin would be known as a pioneer of printing for Rhode Island, being one of the first women printers, the first woman newspaper editor, and almanac writer. The press she, James, and Benjamin used can still be seen today at Rhode Island's Newport Historical Society. Cotton Mather's work on inoculation would see him confirmed as a fellow to the Royal Society of London, an achievement he sought for decades. Zebdiel Boylston would be invited to speak before the Royal Society in December of 1724. He would be encouraged to document his process. Following year, he published an historical account of the smallpox inoculated in New England. It featured a patient-by-patient account of the trial and a 15-step process for completing the procedure. The New England Courant would be remembered as the first newspaper to feature the writing of Benjamin Franklin. It would be a lot less known for being the first independently run newspaper that dared to stand up to the Puritans and the Massachusetts government. To this day, James is mostly remembered as the cruel master in Benjamin's autobiography. His brother would be remembered for his grave wits of the age. Sailing away from Boston and leaving behind his entire family at age 17, with only a few shillings in his pocket, Benjamin was just beginning his own great adventure. Despite what was to come and all he would achieve, and every great success he would obtain, Benjamin would later reflect that leaving his brother James was the first major errata of his life.